Writing findings that clearly show how evidence supports each conclusion represents the final analytical stage of a workplace investigation, the point where the work shifts from analysis into a structured, defensible narrative. At this stage, the goal is no longer simply to summarize what was learned, but to demonstrate, step by step, how the evidence leads to each specific conclusion. To withstand scrutiny from courts, arbitrators, or organizational leadership, findings must be framed as reasoned conclusions supported by substantial evidence, not personal impressions or unsupported assumptions. A defensible investigation report has a clear internal structure. Rather than presenting a general summary, it organizes the analysis by individual allegation or issue. Each allegation is addressed separately, with a consistent flow. A brief summary of the relevant evidence, followed by an explanation of how that evidence was assessed, and ending with a clear conclusion. This structure ensures that the reasoning process is visible and traceable. Within each section, every finding of fact must be explicitly linked to supporting evidence. This means showing the connection between what is concluded and where that conclusion comes from, whether it is a witness statement, a document, an email, often referenced as an exhibit, or system-generated records such as badge logs or audit trails. This evidence-to-finding linkage is essential because it allows a third party to independently follow the logic and verify the basis of each conclusion. A strong findings narrative also uses what can be described as a building block or snippet approach, where each statement builds logically on the one before it. Instead of presenting conclusions in isolation, the report shows a progression of reasoning. For example, an email may show that a code was shared, policy may show that sharing was not authorized, and financial records may then show that the code was used in a way that caused loss. Each step strengthens the next, creating a coherent and cumulative chain of reasoning. Equally important is the explanation of the why. One of the most common weaknesses in investigative reports is stating what is concluded without explaining how that conclusion was reached. In cases where accounts conflict, the report must clearly explain why one version of events was preferred over another. This is typically done through structured credibility assessment, considering factors such as inherent plausibility, consistency, motive to misrepresent, and the presence or absence of independent corroboration. The standard of proof must also be clearly stated. In workplace and administrative investigations, findings should explicitly reflect the balance of probabilities. This is often expressed in clear language such as, "On the balance of probabilities, it is found that..." This makes it clear that the conclusion is based on likelihood rather than absolute certainty, which is consistent with the nature of administrative decision-making. Language and tone are also critical to defensibility. Findings should remain neutral, factual, and aligned with policy terminology. A key distinction must be maintained between factual findings and legal conclusions. For example, it is appropriate to state that an individual made specific comments or engaged in certain behaviors, but not to label those actions as legal violations such as harassment in a legal sense. That determination is typically reserved for decision-makers who apply legal or policy frameworks to the established facts. The report should also avoid vague or qualifying language that weakens clarity, such as fairly, mostly, or roughly. These terms can suggest uncertainty where a clear evidentiary basis exists. Instead, findings should be stated directly and in plain language. At the same time, the tone must remain neutral and professional, avoiding emotionally loaded terms that imply guilt or innocence before the decision is formally made. Transparency is another essential requirement. A defensible report does not selectively present only supporting evidence. It must also include exculpatory information evidence that may point away from the conclusion alongside inculpatory evidence. If relevant information is missing or could not be obtained, this should also be clearly noted, along with an explanation of why it was unavailable. This level of openness strengthens the credibility of the analysis and demonstrates procedural fairness. Ultimately, findings must be written with the expectation that they will be scrutinized in detail. Every conclusion should be capable of being independently followed, tested, and understood. For this reason, contemporaneous records and objective evidence generally carry greater persuasive weight than documents created after the fact or in anticipation of dispute. At the end of the process, findings are formally classified typically as substantiated, unsubstantiated, or unfounded depending on whether the evidence meets the required standard. Once completed, the results are communicated to the relevant parties in writing. In many systems, the role of the investigator is limited to establishing facts, while disciplinary or corrective decisions are left to separate decision-makers to preserve objectivity and segregation of duties. In this way, the final report is not just a summary of what was reviewed. It is a structured, evidence-based explanation of how each conclusion was reached, closing the investigative process with clarity, discipline, and defensibility.